The freezing wind rattled the shutters of the small homestead as Eliza Carter stared at the hastily scrawled note in her trembling hands, the words blurring through her tears. "Found my fortune elsewhere. Don't wait for me." 5 years of marriage, 4 children with a 5th on the way, and Thomas had abandoned them all with nothing but 8 cruel words on a scrap of paper. December 1878 had brought the harshest winter Ordway, Colorado had seen in decades. Snow piled against the walls of the modest cabin, and the dwindling firewood wouldn't last another week. Eliza pressed a hand to her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick as if sensing her despair. In the next room, she could hear her children Mary, just 7 years old, 5-year-old twins James and Joseph, and 3-year-old Sarah playing quietly, unaware that their father had walked out of their lives forever. Eliza sank into the wooden chair by the kitchen table, her mind racing. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, the town 10 miles beyond that. With the snowdrifts taller than her oldest child, and no horse Thomas had taken their only mount, there was no way to reach help. The meager supplies in the root cellar might stretch 2 weeks if she rationed carefully, but then what? The sound of hoofbeats cutting through the howling wind snapped her from her thoughts. Hope flared briefly had Thomas returned, but died just as quickly. She knew in her heart he wasn't coming back. Eliza wiped her tears and stood, grabbing the rifle from above the mantel. Whoever approached might be friend or foe, but either way, she'd protect her children. She tucked the note into her apron pocket and moved to the window, peering through the frost-rimmed glass. A lone rider emerged from the swirling snow, hunched against the biting cold atop a sturdy chestnut horse. The stranger dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially hidden beneath a snow-dusted hat and scarf. When he knocked, Eliza positioned herself behind the door, rifle ready. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "Name's Daniel Lawson, madam. I'm looking for shelter from this storm. I've got supplies to trade for a spot by your fire." Eliza hesitated, her finger hovering near the trigger. "My husband's just out back checking the livestock," she lied. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "No disrespect intended, madam, but I don't see any fresh tracks, and your chimney was near cold when I rode up. I'd wager your husband ain't around, but I ain't here to cause trouble. Just need shelter till this storm passes." Mary appeared at Eliza's side, tugging her skirt. "Mama, who's that?" "Hush, child," Eliza whispered, then louder to the stranger. "Step back from the door and keep your hands where I can see them." When she cautiously opened the door, Daniel Lawson stood 6 feet back as instructed, gloved hands raised to shoulder height. The wind whipped snow into the cabin, and Eliza shivered, but kept the rifle steady. His eyes, startlingly blue against his wind-burned face, met hers with a direct, honest gaze. "I was a scout for the cavalry. Know these mountains well. Been trailing a band of Mustangs when this storm hit. Got coffee, sugar, and some jerky in my saddlebags. And I'm handy with an axe if you're needing wood." As if to emphasize the desperate situation, the fire in the hearth sputtered, flames dipping dangerously low over the few remaining logs. "Mama, I'm cold," Sarah whimpered, appearing in the doorway behind her sister. Daniel's gaze shifted to the children, then back to Eliza's face, softening as he noticed her condition. "You've got little ones to think about, madam, and one on the way, I see. I give you my word as a man who still believes in such things. I mean you no harm." Eliza studied him, noting the crow's feet around his eyes and the honest set of his jaw beneath several days' worth of stubble. He looked to be in his early 30s, with lines of hardship etched into his weathered face, but his eyes held no malice. "You can stable your horse out back," she said finally, lowering the rifle slightly. "But the gun stays with me, understand?" He nodded, respect evident in his expression. "Perfectly, madam. I'll tend to my horse and bring in those supplies. Then, with your permission, I'll see about cutting some firewood before we lose the light." As Daniel Lawson led his horse toward the small barn, Eliza watched through the window, rifle still in hand, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake or been blessed with the answer to a prayer she hadn't yet had time to offer. Within an hour, Daniel had stacked fresh firewood beside the hearth, the flames now dancing high and warming the small cabin. He'd moved with quiet efficiency, speaking little but observing much, his eyes taking in the sparse furnishings and the empty spot at the table where Thomas should have been. "Your husband," he said finally, accepting a cup of coffee made with his own supplies. "He's not coming back, is he?" Eliza glanced at the children who were gathered around the stranger, fascinated by his stories of wild horses and distant mountains. She lowered her voice. "He left this morning. Took our only horse, most of our money." Her hand drifted to her belly. "Left this note." Daniel read the crumpled paper, his jaw tightening. He said nothing but folded it carefully and returned it to her. "I've got some stew cooking," Eliza said, changing the subject. "It's not much, but you're welcome to share it." "I appreciate that," he replied, then hesitated. "Mrs. Carter, I don't mean to pry into your affairs, but how are you fixed for the winter?" Eliza busied herself with stirring the thin stew, unwilling to meet his eyes. "We'll manage," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Madam," Daniel said gently, "that storm out there is just getting started. I've wintered in these mountains enough to know this one's going to last. Your woodpile was near empty, and I don't see enough provisions to feed these young'uns through next week, let alone the winter." Tears threatened again, but Eliza blinked them back. "What would you have me do, Mr. Lawson?" "I can't exactly pack up 4 children and trek to town in this weather, especially not in my condition." Daniel stroked his chin thoughtfully. "No, you can't. But I could stay on a spell, help out. Get your woodpile built up proper, maybe do some hunting when the weather breaks." "I was heading nowhere in particular anyway." Eliza looked at him sharply. "And what would you expect in return? A roof and a spot by the fire," he said simply. "Maybe a meal when there's enough to share. I don't take charity, but I'm offering fair trade my labor for your hospitality." "Why would you do that? You don't know us." Daniel's gaze drifted to the children, then back to her. "My ma raised me to believe you don't turn your back on folks in need, especially not women and children. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've spent too many winters alone. Company might be a welcome change." That night, after the children were asleep and Daniel had settled himself on a bedroll near the hearth, Eliza lay awake in her bed, listening to the storm howling outside. The stranger's presence both comforted and unsettled her. He seemed honorable enough, but she'd thought the same of Thomas once. Yet what choice did she have? Without help, they wouldn't survive until spring. The baby within her kicked again, a reminder of the life she was responsible for bringing safely into the world. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "I hope I've done right by letting him stay. Please watch over us all." On the other side of the thin wall, Daniel Lawson stared into the dying embers, making silent plans for the morning. He hadn't told the full truth about why he'd been in these mountains. He wasn't just tracking wild horses, he was running from memories, from the ghosts of a family lost to fever 3 years past. His wife Caroline and their infant son had been buried on the same awful day, leaving him hollow inside, a man with nothing but his horse and his skills. He hadn't expected to find another family in need, certainly hadn't planned on becoming their protector. But seeing Eliza Carter standing in that doorway, fierce despite her fear, determined to protect her children even as her world crumbled around her. Something long dormant had stirred within him. Purpose, perhaps, or the faint echo of the man he'd been before grief had sent him wandering. Whatever it was, Daniel knew he couldn't leave them to face the winter alone. For now, that would have to be enough. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, shrouding the cabin in a cocoon of white. During that time, Daniel established a routine. Each morning, he'd rise before dawn, stoke the fire, and head out to clear paths to the outhouse, well, and barn. By the time Eliza and the children woke, he'd have coffee brewing and oftentimes would have prepared a simple breakfast from their limited supplies. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke, revealing a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts as far as the eye could see. Daniel stood on the porch, assessing their situation. "I need to hunt," he told Eliza, who joined him with Sarah on her hip. "We're going to need meat and plenty of it." "The snow's too deep," she protested, "and there's no game this close to the homestead anyway." "I've got snowshoes in my pack, and I know where to look," he assured her. "If I leave at first light tomorrow, I can be back before dark." That evening, as Daniel sharpened his hunting knife by the fire, young James approached him hesitantly. "Are you going to stay with us forever, Mr. Lawson?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with childish hope. Daniel glanced at Eliza, who pretended to be absorbed in her mending but was clearly listening. "I'm going to stay until you folks don't need me anymore," he answered carefully. "Papa said he was going to stay forever too," James said with the brutal honesty of a child, "but he didn't." Eliza set down her sewing. "James, that's enough. Time for bed." Later, when the children were asleep, Daniel found Eliza sitting alone at the table, staring at her husband's note again. "You should burn that," he said quietly, sitting across from her. "I keep trying to understand," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. 5 years together, 5 children, and he just left. Was I such a poor wife?" Daniel shook his head. "This isn't about you, Mrs. Carter. Some men just aren't cut out for responsibility. They run when things get hard. And you?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. "What are you running from, Mr. Lawson?" The question caught him off guard. He considered deflecting, but found himself wanting to offer honesty in return for the trust she'd placed in him. "My wife and son died 3 years ago. Fever took them both in the space of a week." The words still hurt to say aloud, but less than they once had. "I couldn't bear to stay in our home after that, so I've been drifting. Working cattle drives in summer, trapping in winter, just existing." Eliza's expression softened with compassion. "I'm sorry for your loss, as I am for yours," he replied. "Different circumstances, but loss all the same." A moment of understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared pain that needed no further words. The following day, Daniel returned from hunting with a deer slung across his shoulders, triumph evident in his tired smile. That night, they feasted on venison stew, the first proper meal they'd had in weeks. As January turned to February, Daniel established a daily pattern. He'd hunt when weather permitted, repair what needed fixing around the homestead, and chop endless cords of firewood to keep the cabin warm. On days when blizzards made hunting impossible, he'd whittle toys for the children or teach James and Joseph how to tie useful knots. Eliza, for her part, began to relax her vigilance. The rifle no longer sat constantly within arm's reach, and she found herself looking forward to the evenings when, after the children were asleep, she and Daniel would sit by the fire and talk. He told her of his adventures in the cavalry, of the magnificent wild horses he'd tracked, of distant mountains and wide prairies. She shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of her journey west with her parents as a young woman, of meeting Thomas at a barn dance in Kansas, before they'd continued on to Colorado. They never spoke of the future beyond the coming spring. It was an unspoken agreement. Daniel was there to help them survive the winter. Nothing more. Yet Eliza couldn't deny that something was changing between them, a cautious friendship evolving into something deeper neither was ready to name. One night in mid-February, a particularly vicious storm battered the cabin, the wind finding every crack and crevice. The children, frightened by the howling gale, had all piled into Eliza's bed, finally falling asleep in a tangle of limbs around their mother. Daniel had just banked the fire for the night when a particularly strong gust rattled the cabin, followed by a sharp cracking sound and a rush of frigid air. Part of the roof over the main room had given way under the weight of ice and snow. "Eliza," Daniel called, no longer bothering with formality. "Get the children up. We need to move them away from this side of the cabin." For the next hour, they worked frantically. Daniel climbing onto the roof in the heart of the blizzard to secure a tarp over the damaged section, while Eliza moved the children to the far corner of the cabin and piled every available blanket around them. When he finally came back inside, Daniel was nearly blue with cold, his clothes frozen stiff. Eliza pushed him toward the fire. "You need to get out of those wet clothes before you freeze to death," she ordered, practical despite her concern. "The roof will hold for now," he managed through chattering teeth, "but we'll need to repair it properly when the storm passes." "Never mind the roof," Eliza said, helping him remove his frozen coat. "You're no use to us dead from pneumonia." As she helped him change into dry clothes, their hands accidentally touched and both froze for an instant, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. Daniel's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them before he looked away. "Thank you," he said quietly, retreating to his bedroll. "You should get some sleep. The children will be restless after all this excitement." Eliza nodded, but as she turned to join her children, she realized something had fundamentally shifted between them tonight. In that brief moment of shared danger, they'd become something more than reluctant allies of convenience. What exactly, she wasn't sure, but the thought both thrilled and terrified her. As February gave way to March, the worst of winter's fury began to abate. The days grew incrementally longer, the sun occasionally strong enough to create patches of bare ground around the cabin. Daniel had repaired the roof and reinforced it against future storms. Game became more plentiful as animals emerged from their winter hideaways, and their meals improved accordingly. Eliza's pregnancy advanced, her movements becoming slower, more deliberate. Daniel took on more of the household chores without being asked, often sending her to rest while he saw to the children's needs. The little ones had grown attached to him, following him around like ducklings, begging for stories and shoulder rides. One evening, as Daniel taught the twins how to clean and oil his revolver, with no bullets, of course, Mary sidled up to Eliza as she rocked Sarah to sleep. "Mama," the 7-year-old whispered, "is Mr. Daniel going to be our new papa?" Eliza nearly dropped the sleeping toddler. "Mary." "What a thing to ask. Mr. Lawson is helping us through the winter, that's all. But he takes care of us like a papa should," Mary persisted. "And he makes you smile. Papa never made you smile that way." Out of the mouths of babes, Eliza thought, her cheeks warming. Had her daughter seen what she herself had been unwilling to acknowledge? "It's complicated, sweetheart," she said finally. "Mr. Lawson had a family once and he lost them. He might not want another." "Well, I think he does," Mary declared with childish certainty. "He looks at you the way Mr. Johnson looks at Mrs. Johnson at church, all soft-eyed." Before Eliza could formulate a response, a sharp pain gripped her abdomen, causing her to gasp. The contraction passed quickly, but was followed by another 10 minutes later. "Daniel," she called, trying to keep the alarm from her voice. "I think the baby's coming." His head snapped up, concern instantly replacing the relaxed expression he'd worn while teaching the boys. "It's too early," he said, crossing to her side. "Only by a few weeks," she reassured him, though her own worry must have shown in her eyes. "Babies come when they're ready, not when we expect them." Daniel took charge with calm efficiency, sending Mary to fetch clean linens and heating water on the stove. He helped Eliza to bed, then hesitated. "I've delivered foals and calves," he said uncertainly, "but never a human baby." Despite her discomfort, Eliza managed a smile. "I've done this 4 times before. Just stay close and I'll tell you what I need." The labor progressed rapidly, far faster than with her previous children. As midnight approached, Eliza's pains came barely a minute apart. "Daniel," she gasped between contractions, "you'll need to help me. The baby's coming now." White-faced but determined, Daniel positioned himself at the foot of the bed. "Tell me what to do," he said steadily. "Just be ready to catch," she managed, before bearing down with all her strength. Minutes later, the lusty cry of a newborn filled the cabin. Daniel stared in wonder at the tiny life in his hands, a perfect little boy with a shock of dark hair. "You have a son," he told Eliza, his voice thick with emotion as he carefully placed the infant on her chest. Eliza's exhausted face transformed with joy as she cradled her new baby. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you." Daniel swallowed hard, memories of Caroline and their son threatening to overwhelm him. But this wasn't a moment for ghosts. This was life, raw, messy, miraculous life, and he was part of it again somehow. "What will you name him?" he asked softly. Eliza studied the baby's face, then looked up at Daniel, a tentative question in her eyes. "I was thinking William Daniel Carter, if that would be all right with you." The simple gesture nearly undid him. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and gently touched the infant's tiny hand with one calloused finger. That night changed everything. As Daniel sat in the rocking chair, holding little William while Eliza slept, he realized he could no longer pretend he was just passing through their lives. These children, all 5 of them now, had worked their way into his heart. And Eliza. Eliza had awakened something in him he'd thought died with Caroline. Not the same love, nothing could ever be the same as his first love, but something new and unexpected. A second chance he'd never thought to find, let alone deserve. But what did Eliza want? She'd been abandoned by the man who'd sworn to love and protect her. Why would she risk her heart again, especially with a drifter who'd spent the last 3 years running from his own pain? As March progressed, bringing the first tentative signs of spring, Daniel found himself contemplating the future with increasing anxiety. The roads would soon be passable. The Carter family would no longer be in imminent danger. His original purpose for staying would be fulfilled. Eliza seemed equally uncertain about what lay ahead. She'd catch herself watching Daniel with the children, a wistful expression crossing her face before she'd quickly look away if he noticed. They continued their evening talks by the fire, but a new tension had crept in, unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. One afternoon, as Daniel chopped wood in the yard, the twins racing around him in some elaborate game of their own invention, a rider approached the homestead. Daniel paused, axe in hand, watching warily as the stranger drew nearer. "Afternoon," the man called, reining in his horse. "I'm looking for the Carter place. This it?" "It is," Daniel confirmed, resting the axe against the chopping block. "Something I can help you with." "Name's Sheriff Hollister from Ordway," the man said, dismounting. "Got some news for Mrs. Carter." Eliza appeared in the doorway, little William cradled in one arm. I'm Mrs. Carter, Sheriff. What news? The sheriff removed his hat. Madam, I regret to inform you that your husband Thomas Carter was found dead last week in Pueblo. Bar fight gone bad from what I understand. Daniel watched Eliza carefully, unsure what emotion might cross her face: grief, shock, perhaps even relief. Her expression remained remarkably composed. I see, she said quietly. Thank you for riding all this way to tell me. There's more, madam, the sheriff continued. Seems your husband had some gambling debts. The creditors took his horse and whatever else he had of value, but they're claiming he still owed nearly $200. Eliza paled. I have no way to pay such a debt, Sheriff. As you can see, we barely have enough to get by. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Well, that's the thing, madam. These aren't the sort of men who take no for an answer. They might come looking for payment one way or another. Daniel stepped forward. They'll have to come through me first. The sheriff eyed Daniel with new interest. And you are? Daniel Lawson. I've been helping Mrs. Carter and her children through the winter. I see, the sheriff said, his tone suggesting he saw quite a bit. Well, Mr. Lawson, these are dangerous men. If they decide to make trouble, you send word to me in Ordway. After the sheriff departed, Eliza sat heavily at the kitchen table, William still nestled against her chest. Thomas is dead, she said, as if testing how the words felt in her mouth. Daniel sat across from her. How do you feel about that? She considered the question carefully. I should feel something, shouldn't I? Grief, anger, something. But all I feel is numb and worried about these debts. You're not responsible for his gambling, Daniel said firmly. These men won't care about that, Eliza replied. As far as they're concerned, I'm Thomas's widow, so his debts are mine now. Daniel's jaw tightened. I won't let anyone threaten you or the children. Eliza looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him with new clarity. You can't stay forever, Daniel. We both know that. Why not? The question escaped before he could consider it, hanging in the air between them. Because this isn't your life, she said softly. These aren't your responsibilities. You came to help us through the winter, and you have. More than that, you helped bring William safely into the world. But spring is coming. You'll want to move on, follow those wild horses of yours. Daniel shook his head. You still don't understand, do you? I haven't thought about those horses in months. I've been thinking about Mary's reading lessons and Joseph's talent for whittling. I've been thinking about how James wants to learn to fish when the creek thaws, and how Sarah's face lights up when I tell her stories about the stars. His voice grew quieter, more intense. I've been thinking about you, Eliza, how brave you are, how you never complained, not once, even when things looked hopeless, how beautiful you are when you laugh, which wasn't nearly often enough before I came along. Eliza's eyes widened. Daniel, I know it's too soon, he continued. I know Thomas just left a few months ago, and now you find out he's dead. I know you've got no reason to trust another man's promises. But I'm not asking for anything right now except the chance to stay. To keep helping, to keep being part of this family for as long as you'll have me. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes. And what happens when you wake up one morning and realize you've trapped yourself with a woman and 5 children who aren't even yours? Daniel reached across the table, taking her free hand in his. These past months haven't been a trap, Eliza. They've been the first time since Caroline and my son died that I've felt alive again. You and these children gave that back to me. A tear slipped down Eliza's cheek. I'm afraid, she whispered. Afraid to hope, afraid to trust. I know, he said gently, but I'm not Thomas. I don't make promises lightly and I don't break them. Just think about it. That's all I'm asking. The following week brought the first real thaw, muddy roads gradually becoming passable. Daniel rode into Ordway for supplies, returning with not only food and necessities but also with news. I spoke to Sheriff Hollister. he told Eliza as they unpacked the goods. Those men Thomas owed money to their known criminals. The sheriff's been looking for an excuse to run them out of the territory. So they're still a threat, Eliza concluded, her expression worried. For now, Daniel acknowledged, but I've been thinking. The homestead is in your name too, right? Not just Thomas's, Eliza nodded. We filed the claim together. Then it's legally yours now. You could sell it, take the children somewhere safer. Sell it. Eliza looked around the small cabin that had been her home for the past 5 years. And go where? I heard the mercantile owner is looking to sell his business, Daniel said carefully. It comes with living quarters above the shop, in town with neighbors close by. Safer. I know nothing about running a store, Eliza protested. And how would I afford such a purchase? I have savings, Daniel admitted. Nearly $800 from my cavalry days and trapping. I've had no reason to spend it, just been carrying it with me all these years. Eliza stared at him in shock. You'd use your savings to buy a store. For me, for us, Daniel corrected gently. If you'll have me, not as a boarder or a hired hand, but as more. Are you proposing to me, Daniel Lawson? Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel took a deep breath. I reckon I am, though I'm making a poor job of it. You deserve better than a proposal over a sack of flour and coffee beans. A smile tugged at Eliza's lips. I don't know. There's something rather fitting about it, considering how our acquaintance began. Hope flared in Daniel's chest. Is that a yes? It's I need time, Eliza replied honestly. This is all happening so fast. A few months ago I was a married woman. Now I'm a widow with a newborn being proposed to by a man I've known less than 4 months. Daniel nodded, accepting her caution even as disappointment coursed through him. I understand. Take all the time you need. 2 nights later, Eliza was awakened by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. A lot of horses. Daniel was already up, buckling on his gun belt in the dim light of the banked fire. Stay with the children, he instructed tersely. Keep the rifle handy. Before she could protest, he slipped outside, closing the door quietly behind him. Eliza grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, straining to see in the darkness. She counted 5 riders circling the cabin, their faces obscured by the night. Carter, one of them called. Thomas Carter, get out here, you cheating dog. Daniel's voice rang out clear and firm from the shadows of the porch. Thomas Carter is dead. Whatever business you had with him died too. There was a moment of confused silence, then the leader spoke again. Who the hell are you? Name's Lawson. I'm looking after Mrs. Carter and her children now. Well, Lawson, Carter owed us $200. Someone's got to pay it. The man's dead, Daniel repeated. He left nothing of value behind. There's nothing here for you. That's where you're wrong, the leader replied. He left a woman and some land. Both worth something. Eliza's blood ran cold at the implication. Daniel must have felt the same, because his next words were delivered in a deadly calm tone that she'd never heard from him before. You've got exactly 1 minute to ride away from here, he said. After that, I start shooting. Laughter rippled through the group of men. There's 5 of us and 1 of you, mister. True, Daniel acknowledged. But I was a cavalry scout and a sharpshooter. I can guarantee at least 3 of you won't leave here alive. Which 3 wants to volunteer? The confidence in his voice must have given them pause, because the men fell silent, shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. Besides, Daniel continued, Sheriff Hollister knows you're in the area. He's got a posse assembled in town, just waiting for an excuse to come after you. You really want to risk all that for a dead man's debt? After what felt like an eternity, the leader spat on the ground. This ain't over. It is if you're smart, Daniel countered. Ride out now, keep riding past the territorial line, and we'll forget we ever saw each other. With muttered curses, The men wheeled their horses around and galloped off into the night. Daniel remained on the porch, revolver still drawn, until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. When he finally came back inside, Eliza threw herself into his arms, trembling with relief and delayed fear. "They could have killed you," she whispered against his chest. Daniel's arms tightened around her. "They would have had to try." Eliza pulled back slightly, looking up at his face in the dim firelight. "You would have died protecting us." "Without hesitation," he replied simply. In that moment, Eliza's last reservations crumbled. This was a man who had demonstrated his character not with words but with actions, day after day for months. A man who had helped deliver her child, who had taught her sons, who had braided her daughter's hair when her own pregnancy swollen fingers couldn't manage the task. Rising onto her tiptoes, Eliza pressed her lips to his in a kiss that conveyed everything she couldn't yet put into words. Daniel froze for an instant, then responded with a gentleness that belied his strength, his hands coming up to frame her face as if she were something precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Eliza whispered, "Yes." Daniel looked confused. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you," she clarified, a smile spreading across her face. "Yes, I'll run that store with you. Yes to everything." Joy transformed Daniel's features, erasing years of hardship and grief in an instant. "Are you certain?" "I don't want you to decide because of fear or—" Eliza placed her fingers over his lips. "I'm deciding because in the darkest winter of my life, you brought light back into our home. I'm deciding because my children adore you and you love them as if they were your own. I'm deciding because when I look at you, I see the future I want, one with a good man who keeps his promises." Daniel captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I will spend every day making sure you never regret this decision." 3 weeks later, on a bright April morning, Daniel and Eliza were married in the small church in Ordway, with all 5 children in attendance. Mary and Sarah wore flower crowns of early spring blooms, while the boys stood proudly in new shirts Daniel had purchased for the occasion. Baby William, just 8 weeks old, slept peacefully in the arms of Mrs. Johnson from the neighboring farm, who had become a friend to Eliza during their preparations for the move to town. After the simple ceremony, they signed the papers for the purchase of the mercantile, which would henceforth be known as Lawson's General Store. The previous owner, eager to retire to Denver, had accepted Daniel's offer and thrown in the inventory as a wedding present. That evening, as they settled into their new quarters above the store, a spacious 4-room apartment that felt like a palace after the small cabin, Daniel found Eliza standing by the window, gazing out at the town's main street. "Having second thoughts?" he asked softly, coming to stand behind her. Eliza leaned back against his chest, sighing contentedly as his arms encircled her. "Not a single one. Just marveling at how much can change in the space of a few months. Last December, I thought my life was over. Now it feels like it's just beginning." Daniel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I felt the same way when I rode up to that cabin in the snowstorm, like I was at the end of something. Never imagined I was actually at the start." "Do you think Caroline would approve?" Eliza asked gently. They'd spoken more about his first wife and son in recent weeks, Daniel gradually sharing his memories as part of his healing. "I know she would," he replied without hesitation. "Caroline always said I was born to be a father. She'd be happy to know I found that purpose again." From the next room came the sound of childish laughter as the older children played some game of their own invention, while William's soft coos indicated he was awake in his cradle. "We should probably rescue Mrs. Johnson," Eliza said, smiling. She offered to watch them for an hour, not wrangle them all evening. Daniel turned her in his arms, looking down at her with such love it made her heart swell. "In a minute," he murmured, lowering his mouth to hers. The kiss spoke of promises kept and new ones made, of winters survived and springs welcomed, of second chances neither had dared to hope for. When they finally parted, Eliza rested her head against Daniel's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you, Daniel Lawson." It was the first time she'd said the words aloud, though he'd told her many times over the past weeks. Daniel's arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Eliza Lawson. You and our children. Always." Over the years that followed, Lawson's General Store became the heart of Ordway. Daniel and Eliza worked side by side, building a thriving business while raising their growing family. William was joined by a brother, Robert, 2 years later, and eventually by twin sisters, Emma and Elizabeth, much to everyone's surprise and delight. The older Carter children took the Lawson name officially when they were old enough to understand what that meant, each making the choice individually in a private conversation with Daniel. Mary, the first to ask, presented him with a hand-drawn document declaring she wished to be known as Mary Lawson henceforth, solemnly asking him to sign as witness. Daniel, overcome with emotion, had treasured that paper as much as any legal document. Thomas Carter became a distant memory, rarely mentioned except when necessary to explain the family's history to newcomers. The debt collectors never returned, having apparently taken Daniel's warning to heart or perhaps encountering Sheriff Hollister's posse elsewhere. On cold winter nights, when snow piled against the windows of their comfortable home behind the store, Daniel would sometimes tell the younger children the story of how he and Eliza met, though the version he shared emphasized the romance, rather than the desperation of those early days. "Your mother stood in that doorway like an avenging angel," he'd say, winking at Eliza, rifle in her hands, ready to defend her children against any threat. "I knew right then she was the bravest woman I'd ever met." "And your father," Eliza would counter, "rode through a blizzard to bring us coffee and sugar when we had nearly nothing, then stayed to make sure we survived the worst winter these parts had seen in decades." What neither mentioned in these family tales was the night, 10 years after their marriage, when a haggard stranger appeared at the store just before closing. Older, grayer, missing several teeth and an eye, but unmistakably Thomas Carter. He'd stood awkwardly, hat in hand, as Daniel and Eliza stared in shock. "I heard in Denver that a Daniel and Eliza Lawson run the store here," he'd said finally. "Wanted to see for myself if it was true. What do you want, Thomas?" Eliza had asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the turmoil she must have felt. "Nothing," he'd answered, surprising them both. "Just wanted to see that you and the young'uns were all right." Daniel had moved protectively closer to his wife. "They're more than all right. They're loved and cared for as they should have been all along." Thomas had nodded, a flicker of something like regret crossing his weathered face. "Good. That's good." He'd looked around the prosperous store, then back at the couple. "I made a mistake walking out like I did." "Biggest mistake of my life." "Yes," Eliza had agreed simply. "You did." There had been no dramatic confrontation, no tearful recriminations, just the quiet acknowledgement of a past better left buried. "The children will be home from school soon," Daniel had said pointedly. "I think it's best if you're gone before they arrive." Thomas had nodded again, understanding the dismissal. At the door he'd paused. "Are they happy, the children?" "They are," Eliza had replied. "Very happy." "Good," Thomas had said again. And then he was gone, back to whatever wandering life he'd chosen over family and responsibility. That night, lying in bed with Daniel's arms around her, Eliza had finally allowed herself to shed tears not for the man Thomas had been or the marriage she'd lost, but for the young, hopeful woman she'd once been, who hadn't known her own worth. "He's nothing to us," Daniel had whispered, holding her close. "Nothing to the life we've built." "I know," Eliza had replied, wiping away the last of her tears. "It just reminded me how close I came to losing everything if you hadn't ridden up that day." "But I did," Daniel had reminded her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Some things are meant to be, I reckon." Looking back over the 2 decades of their marriage, neither Daniel nor Eliza could imagine life having taken any other path. The desperate winter that had brought them together had faded into a cherished chapter in their family's history, the beginning of their story, but far from its most important part. What mattered was everything that came after: the joys and challenges they'd faced together, the children they'd raised, the life they'd built from nothing but trust, hard work, and love that had weathered every season. On their 20th anniversary, with their children grown or nearly so, Daniel presented Eliza with a gift, a small wooden box he'd crafted himself. Inside lay the faded, crumpled note Thomas had left that December day, alongside the first wildflower Daniel had picked for her that spring, pressed and preserved. "Why keep this?" Eliza asked, touching the note gently. "Because without it, we might never have found each other," Daniel replied. "Every ending is someone else's beginning. This was ours." Eliza closed the box and set it aside, taking her husband's hands in hers, and what a wonderful beginning it turned out to be. As they stood together, looking out at the town that had grown alongside their family, at the life they'd built from the ashes of separate heartbreaks, both silently acknowledged the truth they'd discovered in that desperate winter long ago. Sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, and the darkest seasons can lead to the most beautiful springs. For Daniel and Eliza Lawson, what had begun as mere survival had blossomed into a love story neither could have imagined, a testament to second chances, to courage in the face of abandonment, and to the family they had forged together through winter's harshest trials and beyond.